A little dragon attempts to flee in a chamber filled with doors that is gloomy. When the elderly guy turns around to look at himself, he sees another man shutting the door to confine him inside. The elderly man throws a magic sphere his way, but nothing occurs. It's a typical morning in London several years later, but Paul is already experiencing difficulties. He oversleeps, his shoelaces snap, the toaster malfunctions, and he has to run to the location of his job interview. On his way there, a weird elderly guy named Monty interrupts the conversation and claims to have known Paul in the past. Paul doesn't know him and, for the time being, ignores him as he rushes to get in line. Paul had to follow the tiny puppy through an alley after he takes his scarf at that same time. Suddenly, he loses sight of the dog, but he notices a door with the word applicants on it, so he chooses to open it. He discovers Sophie, a lady, who appears to be watching TV and waiting for the interview in a room full with strange objects. Paul sits next to her but is unable to strike up a conversation, so he watches TV instead and realizes he missed the introduction to the business. He still isn't sure what the position entails. All he knows is that the business is called Wells & Company. The tabletop brochure, which just asks, "Feeling lucky?" is also useless. Suddenly, the room is filled with laughter, and Mr. Tanner enters. Paul is instructed to follow him after he rejects another application. He mysteriously knows Paul's name without asking. They ascend the stairs to the board's main office, where Van Spee, Judy, and Casimir are waiting along with the boss, Wells. Paul is asked a ton of odd questions, and he does his best to respond, but he is always perplexed and uncomfortable. His attention is further diverted by the wallpaper's fissures, which he mistakenly perceives to be a map of London. Wells is impressed, but the others are unable to see it. Sadly, Tanner tells him to go after declaring they've had enough. Paul discovers the dog holding his scarf as he exits the premises, almost as if the animal had been waiting. Paul returns home shortly after and, upon learning that his roommate is leaving, becomes unhappy. An argument follows since Paul is unable to cover the rent on his own. Paul hurries to retrieve the letter as it is suddenly pushed through the mail hole by a bizarre claw, astonished to realize it is from Wells since he never provided them his address. Even more unexpected is the note informing Paul that the interview went well, which causes him to rejoice. Paul arrives at work the next day with a great attitude. Tanner picks up Paul and shows him around the office while explaining that they are a legal company and that computers are not permitted there. Receptionist Rosie won't tell him what the job entails either, so after giving him a mug, she calls for Tanner. When they arrive at a location that is being repaired, Tanner strangely becomes concerned about a stapler on the floor and orders Paul to gently walk around it while reassuring him not to freak out. They proceed through a number of odd offices, including one with a large map and several telephones, where Paul believes he sees Monty. They also pass through a room filled with typewriters and one with a lot of tubes, but Tanner won't explain what they're doing and Paul is unable to figure it out. When Tanner finally leads Paul to the deepest office, Sophie is already there and ready. Tanner assures them that someone will bring them duties before departing as they are now both interns. Paul talks incessantly out of anxiousness, but he comes across as quite uncomfortable, and Sophie isn't impressed. Paul is suddenly startled out of his seat as a bizarre monster dashes through the darkness. When he gets a closer look, all he sees is a typical mouse. At that point, Rosie appears and leaves them with many maps, instructing them to circle the areas where bauxite reserves are present. Paul spends the whole morning with Sophie studying the maps, despite the fact that he has no idea what he is doing. When the two stop for lunch, Sophie oddly says she needs coffee even though she just mentioned she didn't enjoy it as they make their way downstairs. Judy then runs into them and takes them to a park. Judy scoops up the canister that is tossed out as a sewage lid suddenly opens. Then she goes on to say that the woman sitting on the bench is reading Atonement, and Sophie has to signal to her when she reads about the character jumping into the fountain. Judy instructs Sophie to stand in the bushes while she keeps an eye on them from a distance since Sophie can't help but wonder how she knows where she is in the book. When Sophie focuses, she starts seeing what the other person sees, which surprises her. The moment the reader reaches the appropriate page in the book, Judy raises her finger in response to Sophie's signal, causing the man who is sitting by the fountain to abruptly fall into the water. A love bond quickly starts as the woman sitting on the bench rushes over to investigate. Judy compliments Sophie on her work and explains that although the man's parents had spent a lot of money planning for their son to wed the woman sitting on the bench, doing it this way has led them to feel it was fate. A perplexed Judy responds to Paul's question by explaining that Sophie is a seer, which means she has mental abilities. Judy then ultimately details the business's operations. It turns out that the majority of Wells' staff members possess magic abilities. They are practical wizards who employ magic to help people in exchange for payment. Judy only brings Sophie with her because, despite the fact that she is an intern, Sophie is already on a whole other level than Paul. Paul goes back to the office in the attic and eats a sandwich while perusing the maps. He brushes the breadcrumbs from his fingers and notices an odd feeling in his palm. He moves his hand curiously over the map after experiencing an odd sensation and noticing that the paper is changing. Wells walks into the room at that point, telling Paul to gaze straight ahead while still feeling the map with his palm. Paul's fingertips are abruptly struck by a current, which points to the area where bauxite resources are present. Paul appears to possess other paranormal skills that enable him to identify certain things. Wells leads Paul to his own office while navigating a room full of printers, delighted by this turn of events. Wells believes Paul may be that diviner because, as he says, the firm is desperately trying to stay afloat. They need a diviner to assist everyone get back on track. Tanner is waiting for them at the office, and to win Paul over, Wells brings up Paul's negligent father, claiming he well understands how it feels. Wells' own father, the original firm creator, coerced his son into signing a document in which he agreed to sell his soul in exchange for lifetime ownership. Wells recognizes Paul's desire to establish himself and assigns him a significant task, which requires him to locate a movable door while keeping his assignment a secret from everyone else. Paul agrees, but is ejected before he can inquire about any hints or specifics. Paul then makes the decision to search the office building level by floor for the door, touching every wall, window, and door in vain. Van Spee, whose supernatural hair moves on its own while she speaks, abruptly interrupts him. She engages in polite small talk, yet her hair spells, "Beware," when she speaks forbidden magic. When Paul departs, the adjoining door blends in with the surrounding wall. Later, Paul attempts to fall asleep at home but is abruptly woken by Casimir. This isn't truly true because his power is to manipulate dreams. He asks why Wells recruited Paul, but Paul refuses to provide the reason as he had promised. Casimir, who is enraged, uses magic to start twisting Paul's leg and causes his teeth to come out and ears to enlarge. Paul is afraid even though this is just a dream and feels compelled to tell him the truth. Casimir prepares to leave after explaining that the movable door could allow access to the Bank of the Dead. Paul briefly believes he is waking up, but this is still a dream, and he is being knocked to the ground. The following day, Sophie arrives at work to see Rosie kissing a stapler. While looking around the office building, Paul notices the words, "Bank of the Dead," written with an arrow and stapler fasteners on the floor. Paul moves downstairs in the direction of the arrow, and as he does, his hands instantly respond to the energy on the walls, unveiling some incredible artwork. In the end, he discovers a dimly lighted basement with a roll-up door that reads, "Goblins Only" on it. Even so, Paul unlocks the door, only to find a standard storeroom within. Tanner arrives and pushes him out before he can give it a good inspection, telling him he isn't permitted inside and telling Paul to stop before something terrible happens to him. Judy, who is still receiving signals from the hands emerging from the sewers, is helping Sophie continue her job in the interim. Judy says that such hands are the property of goblins, who have long worked with wizards and are able to observe people covertly. Judy asks Sophie to sign a lost pet at a store for a mission today so the owner can see her cousin in a few days. It turns out that the image of the dog wearing Paul's scarf represents the missing dog. Returning to Paul, he keeps looking around the building in vain. He finds Tanner and Sophie in conflict about a problem with Sophie's contract when he gets back to his office. Now, when it's time to head home, Sophie can't help stopping to eat a lot of licorice on the way there despite having previously declared her dislike for it. Paul brings her to a bar so she may have a drink and wash her lips when all of a sudden she starts to feel sick. They converse for a bit before getting into a fight over who is performing better at work. Paul runs into Casimir at work the next day, but he presents as though they haven't seen each other since the interview. After that, Paul ascends the stairs and runs into Monty, who acknowledges that he purposefully diverted Paul the previous day so he would attend this company's interview rather than his intended one. Paul insists on going even though Monty doesn't want to till he can go back to the enigmatic chamber he saw the day before. Paul promptly crosses it to reach a second chamber that is packed with odd specimens and other magical devices after realizing from the sensations on his palm that the things within are an illusion. After messing about for a time, Paul discovers a stapler on the floor and is rebuffed when he reaches out to touch it. Paul makes another attempt while using his abilities and finds the ghost of a goblin inside the stapler. When Paul focuses all of his might in his hands, the movable door emerges from concealment, when the creature leads him in that way before disappearing. When Paul shuts the movable door after entering it out of curiosity, it transforms into a towel and he suddenly emerges at a different area of the building. Paul hears conversations coming from an office and looks inside to see Wells discussing Paul's father and the disappearance of the business's previous boss. It is made known that Wells is testing new drugs on the company's workers while also trafficking human souls. The moment they enter into a soul contract, they will lose all sense of self. Sophie is Wells' next victim, which is why her taste has just changed. Even worse, nobody else on the board is aware of this, and everyone's credentials are outfitted with unique surveillance equipment. Paul takes up the towel and, after a few unsuccessful attempts to use it, checks the label after realizing he can't offer them the portable door. Anywhere might be reached by teleportation by pronouncing a spell and the destination. Paul mentions the grocery store to try it, and as soon as he enters, he finds himself inside the freezer. Paul picks up the towel and makes his way back to the business, where he runs into Van Spee, disregarding the strange glances he receives. She reminds him to come to her if he has any information, but he dashes off to his office without listening. When he gets there, he rips off Sophie's badge and tosses it away before explaining what is happening and pulling out a towel to support his claims. After using the magic to unlock the door, Paul enters a bizarre room filled with several movable doors on every wall. When Sophie hears someone there pleading for assistance, Paul hurriedly yanks her out and realizes he must first specify the destination on the label before unlocking the door. He makes another attempt, and this time they are successful in getting to Paul's flat. As soon as Sophie realizes the potential of such power, she starts dragging Paul along on trips throughout the globe. They surf in Jamaica, travel to Alaska and Egypt, and even see the Aurora Borealis. They still come up for work, and Sophie observes the reunion of the cousins in the store, which makes her happy that she is putting her skills to good use. However, they continue to travel whenever no one is watching or when they have a break, and the more time they spend together, the more they connect and get closer. At the beach one afternoon, Paul tells Sophie he likes her. Sophie believes she feels the same way about Paul, but because she has a soul contract, she is unsure if her feelings are real. They thus consent to locating and destroying the contract. Paul just about manages to conceal the towel before Tanner enters as the pair enters the building through the movable entrance. He instantly realizes what is going on after noticing their clothing and the sand on the ground. He insists that Paul put the door back and leave the business permanently if he doesn't want significant repercussions, and then he departs. Paul and Sophie begin debating what to do and decide to return later to get her contract. The two return to the corporate building after dark, but the movable door is unable to get them to Wells' office and instead dumps them down in a printing room. The printers are running on their own, producing rental agreements, contracts for gym memberships, and other documents. It turns out that Wells incorporated soul agreements covertly to these common contracts to trick individuals into unknowingly accepting the sale of their souls. They follow the noises and moving shadows into the map room, where papers are flying and little flames are blazing, after hearing some noises and noticing a stapler on the floor. Paul, who is terrified, opens the movable door to try to enter Wells' office once again, but is instead sent to a dim basement with the words, "Bank of the Dead," written on the floor. The two start hearing noises once more and decide to flee down a very unsettling tunnel after discovering a contract that proves they are snatching souls. They come to a gang of goblins at the end of this tunnel. They flee in fear and eventually find themselves behind the goblins-only door, where Tanner unexpectedly appears. He is revealed to be the clan's leader and a shape-shifting goblin. Wells also appears as he chastises them for ignoring his warnings. Wells tells Tanner and his goblins to go, but Tanner declines, arguing that the wizards are useless without the help of the goblins. Wells uses his power to turn a group of goblins into office supplies after an altercation breaks out. Paul and Sophie seize the chance to use the movable door to flee, but they forget that it belongs to whoever shuts it, so Wells leaps on it to regain possession. The two are now confined in the area with all the doors when they unexpectedly hear Wells Sr.'s voice. It is revealed that Wells used a newborn dragon to lure his father to this location in the past, trap him there, and then take over the business. Paul recalls that Wells Sr. has a contract that should enable him to exert control over his son, but the man adds that he is unable to utilize it because the soul contract has to be placed in the Bank of the Dead in order to be effective. Paul starts looking for a way out since he believes they still have a shot, but doors are everywhere. Wells Sr. claims that all doors lead to nothingness and that he has previously tried. Paul, however, focuses on using his abilities, and after much work, he eventually discovers the escape. When they reach the company, Wells Sr. is eager to make preparations. He asks Paul to take Wells' contract to the bank while he goes to see his bad son, and Rosie goes to pick up her husband. When they reach the streets, Wells Sr. is eager to confront his evil son. The gang hastily descends to the lower level, where the goblins are removing all of the soul contracts. Wells Sr. locates his son right away, and the two engage in a violent combat where they trade hundreds of magical blows, shattering the chamber around them and sending the goblins into a panic. Paul and Sophie try to sneak away to get the door as magic energy shoots everywhere, but Paul is pushed down and taken captive by a troop of goblins. The goblins charge towards Sophie as she tries to reach Judy for assistance using her skills. Paul, who is attempting to fence the goblins off in a desperate attempt to save Sophie, is trapped in a net. At that point, Wells Sr. receives a stapler from Rosie, who tosses it at him. Using his magic, Wells Sr. hits the stapler, releasing a goblin that had been concealed within. Rosie then reveals that she, too, is a goblin in her real form, and she immediately runs to see the just liberated man, saying that the two of them are Tanner's parents. While the family shares a heartfelt moment, Wells seizes the chance to surprise his father and capture him once more. When Paul tries to pounce on him, Wells' magic quickly deflects him. Finally arriving on the scene at that point, the other board members attempt to stop Wells, but he keeps them at bay by threatening to murder his father. Then, using magic to capture Sophie, he demands that Paul turn over his soul contract in return for her life. Suddenly, Sophie contacts Paul via telepathy and informs him that he has the ability to build portal doors from nothing. When Paul focuses and extends his hand, a number of doors materialize in front of him. As soon as he enters the death bank, he summons one of them beneath his feet and presents Wells' soul contract to a worker while requesting a unique deal. Wells Sr. was able to use magic to confine his wicked son while Sophie took back the towel to unlock the entrance to the dark area because as soon as the employee took the Signer's soul, Wells' abilities vanished. Then Wells Sr. locks his kid inside as retaliation for everything he had to endure over the last few years. The door never opens again, Wells Sr. declares after tearing out the towel's usage instructions. Sophie is concerned about Paul, but he returns with his own set of abilities and gives Sophie the contract he obtained in exchange for Wells. The couple ultimately kisses as everyone cheers. Paul then seizes the towel and places it inside a laundry truck so that nobody may access it once more. In the end, the board meets with Sophie and Paul and extends an employment offer. They both agree, and Sophie uses her telepathy to let Paul know that her emotions are genuine. They then hold hands. The towel eventually arrives to a hotel, where a maid unintentionally casts the charm.